What's cooking? We're back with another video. Today I'd like to talk about the Mongolian invasions of Japan from 1274 and the invasion in 1281 respectively. Now, why am I doing this video? What are the reasons? Well, there's sort of a trifold of reasons for doing the video. Number one is the very lush, graphically inclined video game that you see behind me, the 2020's Ghost of Tsushima, which has gained a lot of popularity as of late. I believe there's even a movie planned in the works, if I'm not mistaken. The second reason is Marco Polo's The Travels. He mentions the Mongolian invasion of Japan. So there's a very early, if not the first rendition of Asian history relayed for European audiences through descriptions found in the book. So it has some historical significance, right, in terms of European history. The third reason, however, the most important one, is the rarity of Japanese conquests outside its border. In this instance, you do have a foreign nation attacking Japan, which is quite rare throughout the history due to its sort of island status. Usually what you get with the samurais is this sort of in-clan fighting amongst themselves, where the clans themselves would have a different representation of colors pertaining to their clan most often, or you would have feudal lords or the daimyo in Japanese who would maximize as much military strength as possible and foster the strength against other enemies within the nation of Japan. You can see the fact that Japanese were very much fighting amongst themselves through armor as well. I'm going to pull up a picture of the helmets. Well, it's a reproduction, but you get the idea. While having very distinguished features, you would easily, pick out who you were fighting, and you would not mistake the enemy, as it were, through the ornamentation of the different helmets you see here. Although, all helmets were not that practical as well. I mean, there are instances of helmets having very many rivets, as making them very heavy, making them less practical, as it were. And some scholars have also said that a lot of the helmets were inspired by both the Chinese and Korean representation of helmets as well. So we shouldn't discount this fact. In addition to the helmets, you also have some rarity in terms of usage of masks. And these are interesting, right? You have masks with highly expressive features such as wrinkles and smiles, and some have removable noses, and even mustaches you get. Also, even some have fangs, so they're quite elusive in that regard. But as I mentioned, they are not super common during that time period. They also have different functions as well. Some masks covering some subsections of face as well. The somen in Japanese, the mask covering the whole face, would have been amongst the most rare in terms of usage of masks in samurai history. There must have been a very high element of psychological terror as well in using the masks. An additional interpretation which I have is that there might be some very expressive relation in terms of the usage of the armor. There's a video, for instance, in which Tobias Kappel is sort of this expert on medieval European armor, and he mentions that the armor was very much perceived as a sort of steel skin relating to the individual. So there would be this very innate relationship with the armor. And why not have like expressive use of armor? The details could perhaps convey sort of traits of personality relating to the wearer, and they might be highly distinguished as well. So why shouldn't this principle hold true for the samurais as well? Now, before we get into the Mongol invasion itself, we got to do a little history 101. I mean, first of all, we're dealing with China under the Mongol Empire. It's a known fact that throughout, China's vast history, it's very seldom been unified. The conception of a unified single nation state is very much something that pertains to modern times. The Mongols would have been a major thorn to the Chinese as well as many other nations. I mean, just look at the map behind me. I mean, we're dealing with an extremely vast and large territory, stretching all the way from Eastern Asia all the way into Europe in the West. It's really expansive and it's really non-comparable in history. I mean, you might make a comparative analysis to the British Empire, but that's really the only exception that I can think of. And as well as the empire here being in 1280 really in its expanded state, although they were still wanting new territories to incorporate into the empire. I mean, as well as their struggles with Russia, they might want to expand into Poland and further into the Western Europe during the time period. But we do know that the whole of China was eventually taken by the Mongols, starting with Genghis Khan and his successors, and ending with Emperor Kublai Khan, who I pictured here on the right. Got the image from Wikipedia. Is he's the striking lad there on the right. Now, how did the Mongols came to be this sort of fierce warriors that they're known as? Well, I mean, they used a wide variety of tactics. I mean, they were really known for their kind of light cavalry, right? And as, expert archers, they used a composite bow with a very far reach compared to a lot of the enemies which they would have met during the time. They also knew a lot about their enemies in general and adopted tactics and technological innovations from them. China being a prime example of that, as we'll see later. And often we're also talking about very speedy, nomadic conquest, which they took on in great stride. So there was certainly a lot of ingenuity and creativity in the way that they performed during warfare. The cliche is always that they were like fully barbarous and had very little penchant for any sort of afterthought or tactical manipulation, but that's just not at all true if you look at the historical record. Now, with Japan, an interesting question arises because how are you going to take it? You're not going to take it from the mainland. I mean, you really have to engage in sort of maritime warfare. And the Mongols are not known for that, so I mean that's going to be a real, or was a real problem for them, right? In the two invasions, they are not the equivalent of the Vikings, are very known for their maritime warfare. We should even write that as well. Let's see, naval warfare, such an important feature. And also, I mean, in regards to the Japanese, the intelligence could have been better as well. Although you might make an argument for the first invasion being motivated by exactly that, to gain more intelligence, to know how they perform in battle as well. Now, from the Japanese side, we have the Emperor Go-Uda, who again, photographed here on the left, again from Wikipedia. And you might think he's like pulling all the strings during that time, but he's really more of a religious figurehead. The real power and militaristic prowess lies within the shogunate, and Japanese influences all over, Japanese culture and history and religion. I mean, just the Zen Buddhism itself, which we regard sort of like the epitome of religion in Japan, is really derived from the Shan Buddhism in China. Now, to get into the more explicit reasons for the tensions between both the Japanese nation and the Mongol Empire, well, there are a number of them, right? There is, first and foremost, the refusal to respond to the Great Khan's trade letter, or letter hoping to restore relations among the two parts. We know that it was dismissed by two separate bodies, including the court of the Japanese emperor, to the great dismay of the Mongolians. In fact, I've outlined an extract of the letter behind me, and just from the form of the letter, it's clear that it's not said in a very super friendly tone, so to speak. I mean, we can read this part here, for example, where it states, innumerable people in far-off lands have learned to fear our power and have longed for our virtuous rule. So it's clear that there is some wish from the Mongol side to expand their hegemonic powers and expand their empire in general. Additional reasons include, well, we can look at it from the Mongol point of view as well. There were grievances in terms of Japanese pirates pillaging both Korea as well as China. Although for the Koreans, they did distinguish between regular trade ships and pirates. They did not treat them all the same. They were also very, or at least for some part, very lustful dreams about Japan and Japanese culture pertaining to a haven of treasures of sorts. We do know that the Japanese traded a great amount of gold within the Song dynasty, so it's not completely unfounded. And it's something you see throughout history as well. I mean, the American colonialization, for example, is a prime example of that, where you have this gold and broiled dreams following from settlers who are wishing to seek gold there. I mean, chief among them perhaps Christopher Columbus himself. Finally, the Mongol Empire wanted to include Japanese in a wider world of East Asian politics, particularly pertaining to trade, where they would probably dictate more of the terms which would benefit them in the long run. So the first Mongol invasion of 1274, all the troops were essentially deployed from Korea, which you can see pictured here. You see the length of the traveled path here, and we first embark upon the two islands comprising Tsushima with a slim strait in the middle, making a division, and the secondary island of Iki, the smaller island, before the Mongol troops hit the mainland of Japan. It's hard to know exactly how many forces were utilized. I think we're talking about the tens of thousands. I mean, one source I read was about 15,000, while another mentioned something like 9,000. The numbers are certainly exaggerated from the Mongol side as well, who suffered a defeat. So naturally, they exaggerated the numbers of the Japanese forces to something like over 100,000, which would have been really absurd. The attack for the Japanese would have been a major surprise. They were certainly not expecting the forces to hit the land, even with the sent letter with a rather stern composition. They did not expect an attack. So it's one of those what-if scenarios, because what if the Mongol Empire had sent way more troops? I mean, it certainly seems that the Japanese would have faced far greater troubles. You can see also some of the depictions of a typical samurai warrior behind here. You have the samurai sword located towards the posterior here, which would have been a fantastic secondary weapon. I mean, it's a sword that's highly romanticized, especially following the Edo period of Japanese history, but it would have been utilized here primarily as a secondary weapon after the spear and, of course, archery as well. I mean, the Japanese were master archers as well, employing a longer bow in general than the Mongols did. You also see the Naginata spear here utilized in the front with this protrusion in the front here. It was, elevated a bit, the status of the samurai sword during this period, because it was rather advantageous when you're dealing with foot-to-foot combat. You can imagine a scenario where the ships have just landed on the shore of the mainland or something, or even on the islands, and you would quickly beat the troops in the water with a sword-to-sword combat. So it seemed highly effective as well. I believe the Mongols also used a sort of shorter sword themselves, so they would have been at a disadvantage. The Mongols, on the other hand, generally used light armor, and I stress the word generally because there's also been found later research that the heavy cavalry of the Mongols used a heavier type of armor, more akin perhaps to that of the Japanese. You know, if you have heavier armor, you might have thicker protection as well. And so, especially for the Japanese who use this kind of box-like armor that you see pictured here, believe it's called something like Yuroi in Japanese. It was heavy, but it's certainly effective in taking a blow, especially if you were located on in a horseback. It would have been more advantageous than on foot-to-foot combat. In general, we can say that the aftermath of the first invasion really favored the Japanese, as it was a very swift invasion from the Mongols, and you might even see it like kind of a perhaps a reconnaissance mission from the Mongolese themselves. They might have been after to simply map out the geography and compare the different fighting styles of the Japanese contra the Mongols, right? It would have been important information for them to learn. But nevertheless, it must have been seen as a defeat for the Mongols. Lastly, we can kind of look at this very interesting figure on the right, which is a rather exotic weapon that the Mongols used against the Japanese. These are ceramic and sometimes metal bombs that the Mongols used. They also used poisoned arrows, for example, and crossbows, which would have been unfamiliar to the Japanese at the time. Interestingly, these bombs, I believe they are known as Sen Tian Lei in Chinese. You can perhaps write that. Let's see, Sen Tian Lei. So they were a technological innovation from the Chinese that the Mongolese adopted, which just shows you how much adaptation to the Mongol Empire utilized in warfare. There were certainly, at the end of the first invasion, economic losses on both sides. Certainly for the Koreans, there was a major economic loss in terms of planning and deployment of troops, as well as for the Japanese. Now, following the intermittent period between the two invasions, there are certainly preparations made on both sides. The Japanese are immediately fearful of another attack, and they decide to make a long defensive wall around Hakata Bay. I mean, that would be certainly the chief preparation, if you will, for the Japanese. They don't really fortify Tsushima or Iki, preparing for the inevitable attack from Korea again, but they do really fortify the mainland and take measures to meet the fleet later on. Also, in this intermittent period, there were at least 2 envoys sent to Japan to perhaps ease relations or make the Japanese really surrender to the Mongols when they were given the famous no-head treatment by the Japanese. So quite a harsh treatment, if you will. We also know that Kublai Khan ordered the construction of some 600 warships during this period, and he also sent troops to Korea as well, which I imagine the Korean king was not too happy, and he's again in the position of having to spend a lot of resources on troops and make preparations for war, despite, the economic losses of the first invasion. Essentially, what you see in the attack is a sort of 2-arrowed attack, both a fleet sent from southern China here and another fleet sent from Korea. Although the Chinese fleet is larger, it's estimated that they are around 100,000 men, while the Korean fleet would have been something like 40,000. In the engagement itself in the warfare, the Japanese would have learned a lot from the Mongols in terms of tactical warfare, and it's also been remarked that they probably went back in future situations to regard the traditional Chinese tactical mobilization a bit higher than in previous times, which makes sense, right? However, just isolating the second invasion, it seems like they're really having a rather one-sided tactic of choosing to fortify Hakata Bay and really focusing their main impetus or energy on that sector. We do know that the Korean fleet arrived before the Chinese fleet, and they were met by heavy assault by the Japanese. I mean, there are stories of samurai directly engaging with ships in the water, probably using their spears and samurai swords to very good use. And certainly this time around, the Japanese were not taken by surprise and would have fought very well. Despite this, the most memorable event of of both invasions, I would say, is the kamikaze or divine wind, this essentially tsunami, which really wrecks a ton of Mongolese ships, right? It's depicted as hundreds of ships just littering Imari Bay due to the violent nature of the typhoon. For the Japanese, this was seen very much in terms of a divine intervention, and it's not hard to understand why. The sort of religious folklore associated to natural events is not new in history. It's something that would be mythologized through Japan's histories as well. Most notably during the Second World War, where we see a very different kind of kamikaze, certainly not something as a one-side incident in this invasion. I mean, you do see it throughout history. I mean, the Persian Wars against the Greeks, for example, there were a number of really hard-hitting storms, and a sort of deification of these storms as well is something that you see heavily into play among the Greeks. The major god of these storms would have been Zeus, along with the minor gods. So there's a really rhyming of history, which you see so often. To make some sort of summary of the second invasion here, I do think that the Mongols were essentially stalled by water and heavy fortification from the Japanese side, and they probably meant more resistant than they would have thought. Even though it seemed as a major defeat for the Mongol Empire, Kublai Khan is seen as a great leader throughout the Mongol Empire. He certainly had other achievements, despite the failings of the two Mongol invasions. All right, so I think that's a pretty good place to leave it off. Well, taken as a whole, I think in terms of direct dealings with other foreign powers, the Mongol invasions are certainly a major event. I mean, there's no denying that. Other examples would be what the Japanese invasion of Manchuria or its role in World War II are some prime examples as well. It certainly solidified the Japanese perception of danger coming from overseas, and it might have played a role or influence in the later, more isolationist tactics that you see from Japan during the Edo period as well. But yeah, if you have any comments or suggestions, questions, let me know below. All right.